Resident Evil is a 25-year-old franchise that sought a balance between the action elements of gun gameplay and the dread of horror. Through its history, the balance between these elements have shifted back and forth. Where it started with a focus on the dread of having scarce resources to maneuver through a mansion filled with zombies and other threats in the first Resident Evil, it has leaned more to an action-based experience in the later games. With the release of RE7, this pendulum has swung back to a major focus on its horror-inspired roots. But with the following release of Resident Evil Village, the 8th in the main series and the 30th something I can't count of the whole franchise, it seems that we are starting to see the pendulum swing back to its action characteristics. In this video, I want to make a case that RE8 is not only heavily inspired by RE4, by its structure, mechanics and focus on action, but also that RE8 takes all the elements of the previous installments and brute force them in one package, making RE Village more like a Resident Evil theme park than a game that truly stands on its own in the whole series. For this, we discuss the game itself and its elements, while comparing them to the others in the series. After the controversial release of RE6, a completely to-the-wall action game, which was also a third-person action shooter with co-op and 4 different campaigns, Capcom decided to go back to the drawing board with the franchise. Although RE6 had a lot of content, and I would even say pretty high production quality for its time, it was also tonally an inconsistent mess. Even with almost 5 million copies sold in its first year, it was considered a financial failure. With RE7 they decided to take some risk. They would heavily lean on horror elements, more inspired by the personal dread that's present in games like Amnesia. And for a first in the mainline series, they would also make a first-person perspective game. The result was a more personal experience, where the horror came from jump scares and the trickery of your own mind convincing that certain death was behind the corner. RE7 was a success and brought many new gamers to the franchise. Old RE fans had a bit more mixed feelings. Some appreciated the return to horror and the small-scale locations. Some, like me, felt the game was less Resident Evil horror and more like mainstream horror games like Outlast, being much inspired by jump scares and mainstream horror movies, instead of the puzzle-like survival horror from the first 3 main games. But having said that, I think it's fair to say that most fans were happy with the direction the series seemed to be taking. Capcom decided that the RE7 story, and thus the story of its protagonist Ethan Winters, was done, so the sequel would directly follow up to the events of that game, but they also took in the feedback and shifted focus on the sequel. A big takeaway was that RE7 was considered too scary for many players, resulting in people not finishing the game. This will probably surprise many, since the series always had many horror elements, even in its most action-heavy games. But it assumes that horror as a genre just entails being afraid. Horror, just like any other genre, is a catch-all phrase that connects different kinds of experience that make the audience afraid. But there are different ways to instill fear. Most people that think of horror games think of games like Amnesia and Outlast, where you, the player, are not in a state of defending yourself, and the roaming monsters will kill you and chase you relentlessly. Since the fear of death by these monsters is real, the last thing you want to do is encounter these monsters. These games play upon this fear by suggesting danger and having your mind fill in the rest. In Amnesia, for example, there is a tutorial section where you are totally safe in reality, but this is not stated for any new players. They use elements like sound and moving doors to suggest you are not alone. You will ask yourself questions like, is there a monster behind this corner? Or, if I open this door, what will I find? And most people will always assume the worst and make themselves afraid. I am personally a paranoid person, so these kind of games are not enjoyable for me, but that shows how effective they can be with this. Old Resident Evil had similar elements, but the difference is that you can fight back. Going into a new room means there is a chance you will find a monster, but its dread comes from other reasons. A monster in RE doesn't necessarily mean certain death, but it does potentially mean loss of finite resources, which in this case is health, ammo and healing supplies. A lot of RE games make it immediately clear that in your room there is a monster, by sound cues like the sound we make, background music indicating their presence, or having them in clear view. Yes, they use jump scares, but instead of the feeling that you're about to die and should run, you are now forced to make quick decisions which affect the rest of your playthrough. Should I use ammo now to kill it? Or should I try to dodge it, pass it by without taking damage? Maybe a binary way of putting it, where I don't take into account the unique layout or situation where the player finds himself in. But it is a common question in RE games, and since you don't have a lot of time to think, you have to act fast, while considering many elements like your ammunition and need for it in a later game, your ability to dodge and in case of damage, your use of healing and your need for that in a later game, or the possibility of needing to return to this room. The dread and anxiety comes from being forced to make quick decisions that affect the rest of your playthrough, and your ability to execute those decisions. Even with unkillable chasers like Mr. X or Jack Baker, you still had to decide to either outrun them or do enough damage to stun them, with potential consequences for your resources. This, for me, makes RE a really compelling franchise, even if I don't like horror games or movies. But does this mean that RE7 lacked these elements? No, but it leaned more towards those elements of personal dread. The molded tended to introduce themselves in a lot of jump scare moments, which made them mentally exhausting to go against, even if afterwards you had to deal with the same decision of fighting or outrunning. Especially in the first half of the game this was the case, whereas in the second half you had so much ammo and the molded just kind of rush you like a regular enemy in FPS, losing the dread aspect totally. So Capcom decided that the horror was too much in RE7 and chose to lean more on the action elements of the franchise, downright stating that they would take inspiration of RE4, the first game in the mainline series that heavily favored fast action instead of the slow, plodding pace of the previous game. This resulted in the direction that RE8, or rather Resident Evil Village, took. So what are the characteristics of RE4 that were the inspiration for the latest game? For starters, is the village that RE4 took place in. Most of the previous games took place in a mansion or city in America that was also the hiding place of a laboratory of the Umbrella organization. And the game starts in a moment where the location is overrun by zombies. So as the player, we have to find a way out, while also uncovering what's going on. RE4 was different in that it took place in a remote village somewhere in Spain, where it almost felt like you went back in time. The first hour of the game doesn't even make clear that the common enemies are zombies, but are rather presented as backward outcasts that don't take kindly to strangers. RE4 also really focused on action. It was a third-person shooter, which was an uncommonly used style at the time. You had the ability to aim properly instead of the outlook of the previous games. And because the visitable area was way bigger and you did little backtracking, you were hauling your weapons and items with you, instead of putting them in the item box like the previous games. And you had a vendor from whom you could buy items, but also upgrade your weapons with attachments and straight-up buffs. Many of these gameplay elements have a presence in Village, but the direct comparisons and how they pan out in the game will come out later in the video. RE Village takes place 3 years after RE7. In that game you played Ethan Winters and went to Louisiana to look for Mia, your girlfriend who disappeared 3 years earlier. In the house you fight the Baker family, who all get infected by a special kind of mold, which takes the shape of a young girl named Evelyn and is a form of a bioorganic weapon, or BOW. During the events you get infected with the mold, which gives you a lot of regenerative properties and the ability to withstand a lot of abuse the family puts you through. At the end of the game, you survive the house, kill most of the family members, and save Mia. 9 years later, you are under the protection of Chris Redfield, protagonist of several RE games, professional anti-BOW soldier, and puncher of boulders. You have moved several times in the recent years, but at the start of the game, you live in Romania with your now wife Mia and newborn daughter Rose. Everything seems fine, with the exception of some martial strife. Mia prefers to forget the events of Louisiana, whereas Ethan can't. Before the couple can start a full shouting match, Chris and his new squad execute your wife and abduct you and your daughter. A little time later you wake up next to a crashed car, alone and deserted. This is where the game truly starts. You soon arrive in an old-timey village, overlooked by a castle in the distance. Here the events of the game will take place and its story is separated by different chapters, recognized by the different locations, style of gameplay and horror, and their antagonists. In short, we can outline these chapters as the village with the introduction of our villains, the castle with Lady Demetress, Mansion Benevito with Donna and our doll Angie, the lake with Fishman Moreau, and as final location, the Iron Factory with Heisenberg, followed by the final climax of the game and the final boss fight. All these locations are separated by returning to the village, where you can use your new tools and resources to upgrade your gear and gain access to the new parts of the town. Here you can find key items that give you access to the next chapter and give you a moment of rest before the next chapter starts. I outlined the plot of the game this way because I believe all the different chapters can be connected to playstyles and mechanics that have been characteristic of the RE franchise through the last 20 years. This results in them being unique from each other, but in my opinion derivative from the other titles in the series. Resident Evil is by now a franchise that is mostly recognized as a survival horror series, that during its history has swung back and forth in being more horror-focused or action-orientated. The original trilogy were clearly survival horror games, where the second trilogy were obviously more action games with horror elements. Now with RE7 and 8, it is too early to say if this will also be considered as a trilogy of games, especially since we don't know anything about RE9. Story-wise, the story of Ethan and the Winters family is finished. Maybe the 9th game will also be a first-person game, but we can be sure. Capcom is clearly taking its time with it and is focusing on remaking the older games, with RE4 being the latest and the upcoming one probably being RE5. So maybe the new game will focus more on the survival horror elements, because the RE remakes are leaning more to action. But this is at best a guess. But how are these gameplay elements present in the general gameplay loop of RE8, and how do the mechanics compare to the ones in the earlier games? For starters, let's talk about the defining elements of Resident Evil: shooting, resource management, puzzles, and horror. Resident Evil always had combat. In the earlier games, the camera was locked in specific angles where you moved around with tank tools. This meant that aiming was almost impossible. Instead, when you aimed, you would automatically lock on the enemy and easily hit it with your bullets. But you had to stand still. You could angle up and downwards, but it was, in most cases, only required if an enemy was on the ground close to you, or if you really wanted to go for the head once they were close. RE has played with this shooting and the camera perspective a bit over the years. For example, having third-person aiming in RE4 and 5, but still requiring to be locked in place while aiming. By RE6, this was thrown out for a more mainstream third-person shooter playstyle. For an RE7, it was decided to use a first-person camera and with that have gunplay from the first person. You weren't locked down while aiming, but the weapon wheel was not that powerful and things like reloading and the rate of shooting were slow. This returns in RE8, but it has barrier involved. It is a working system, but it just feels like a subpar version of other shooters. Not that I expect RE to be a great shooter game, since that is not what the franchise is about, but what I do expect is having other features from the older game related to combat to be here. And that is barely the case. In the older game, things like shooting at their legs or stunning them to get access to powerful attacks was great and required fast thinking and a good shot. Now it is best to only go for headshots. It is possible to have a Lycan flinch and in the case of shooting their legs even temporarily immobilize them, but it seems really random whenever this happens. I succeeded once in immobilizing them, but this was after shooting at their legs so many times that I was convinced that this wasn't a possibility. And when it did happen, I felt I should have just shot them in the face. It would have probably taken less bullets and they would be dead. They do carry weapons, but for the life of me I can't make them drop it. I thought this extremely surprising, because even in RE7 you could destroy the legs of the molded, forcing them to crawl. It also seems strange that the zombies present in the castle do follow this older formula. Shooting their legs results in them falling to their knees, which allows you to get some stabs in with the knife and converts in ammo. Sadly, no suplex, but at least there is some choice to be made in how to deal with them. Go for maximum damage by landing headshots, which they don't make easy, or try to stun them and stab them to death. They also tend to carry weapons, which you can shoot out of their hands, although I think it's overall a waste of ammo. It is at least nice that you can make them less of a threat or stop them from hitting you. The most unique enemies are the factory zombies, since they have an engine at their heart with a big light screaming, "Shoot me!" that stuns them when shot. The zombies and Lycans are pretty much identical in the ways they create a challenge and how to deal with them. The first-person perspective does work for the scenes like when Ethan is hurt, close-ups on the monsters or the cutscenes, but gameplay-wise it doesn't really offer anything unique, making it questionable why this was the direction that was chosen, except for the idea that FPS are more mainstream and popular, and that it's a direct sequel to 7 that introduces this perspective and Ethan Winters as the protagonist. Resident Evil is also a game about resource management, but even this has little presence in the game. In the original trilogy, this required decision about what to take in your limited inventory. In those games, you had the magical boxes that all shared the same inventory that you could access from the save rooms. This resulted in the save room being a spot where you would plan your round and decide what to take with you. Now you haul everything with you. The concession is made that key items and treasure don't go into your inventory, but that you carry those freely. This is fine, but the actual inventory management barely requires a thought. You can expand it with upgrades bought at the Duke, but even then you barely go in your inventory to manage it. In my experience, I only had to deal with it when I had stacked up so much ammo for certain weapons that I just started to sell that, since I wasn't afraid that I needed it at all. The briefcase was taken from RE4. That game also had the same inventory system, with the only difference being crafting. In RE4, you still had the different colored herbs that individually took up space, but could be combined to be more effective while also clearing up space. It was not too common for you to find an item that you wanted to pick up, but that your briefcase was full, and that you had to think how to clear space. But a lot of times, you did not have that luxury, having too much green herbs or leftover yellow herbs. At that moment, you had to think ahead and decide what combo would benefit you the most, which could vary based upon the upcoming challenges. In the older games, you also had the different gunpowder that you could combine for different kinds of ammo. Just like herbs, they took up inventory space, but could be combined to regain space. Only now you had to consider which kind of ammo you wanted. In Village, they replaced the herbs and gunpowders to more streamlined reagents, like scrap and alcohol. But those reagents are not stored in your briefcase, but in their own separate menu, just like treasure and key items. Once you actually craft any of the items, they get stored in your inventory. This makes it appealing to just keep the reagents until you need healing or ammo. Crafting can be done safely in a menu, even during combat, and is instantly. Because of these differences, there is little planning required and to contemplate with the crafting system from a resource and inventory standpoint. So long as you look around for these reagents and not waste them, you will always have ammo and always be able to heal yourself, even in the worst scenarios. This is why the inventory is not compelling in Village, and the briefcase aesthetic seems to exist for nostalgic reason rather than creative design. The inventory system lacks the need of planning. It is partly due how the game map is structured. In the older games there was a lot of backtracking, since certain earlier found puzzles required key items that you would acquire later in the game. But because you had limited space, you actually had to consciously make the decision to go there again and decide what you would take in addition to the key item, to make sure you survived the trip. In RE4 this was never the case, because most of the time you were just progressing forward on the maps, instead of backtracking. It's fair to say that it was a big reason to make key item and treasure free to carry, since otherwise a lot of players will be forced to stop in their tracks and decide what to discard and what to hold. RE Village also just mostly progresses forward, from area to area. The only exception here is the village itself, which you will revisit a couple of times. Every time you get access to a little bit more, which is neat, but even this is lackluster. It is cool that one key out of the castle opens a couple of doors here, and gives you some extra loot and weapons, or that well contains some loot, but this just feels like the developers just decided there has to be something to do between these lore chapters, so the village acts like a cooldown period between the segments. The most grievous example is the stone slab that's inside the crypt, locked behind bars. It will be visible the first time you visit the village, but there will be no clue how to open it. But then it just opens out of literally nowhere. I don't think it's a massive coincidence that it just happens to happen after the Benevito mansion, the only area that has no key items that is used for more than one door. I won't argue that one inventory system is inherently better than the other, since both are fine, so long they have a place within the game. I was disappointed in Village in that it had locations that were perfect for this slower pace, where you had to think about what to take with you, but decided to go for the RE4 system plus the addition of crafting, just to make inventory a non-thought. I do think that this current system is better for the actual game, since most of the game is made up from highly separated locations. I just feel disappointed in that it just takes away from the need of thinking ahead and preparing. So long you don't go guns blazing with the need to kill every enemy in sight, ammo and inventory space will just not be an issue. These previous elements just take away from what I personally like from Resident Evil. I don't feel that combat requires thought, except hit head and don't get hit. There's a little amount of planning ahead required, since so long you walk forward you progress. And since resources are not scarce, I don't get tense situations where I have to decide to either fight and spend resources or flee and spare them. Sure, there are jump scares that are successful in startling, but after the initial shock, it's just kill them and see you. This makes enemies not feel like a threat. All of this is not apparent the first time you go through the game, but on reruns you do know the threats and you do know that you get many resources, so the whole experience loses its bite, and with that the intense aspect of the series. This lack in quality is also present in the puzzles of this game. Many are just a case of finding things and placing them to open doors. Even the puzzles that requires a bit more thought are entirely self-containing, or the hints just clearly dull out the answer. When one of the number lock puzzles just say look out of the window to see conveniently placed numbers and set you up for a nonsensical jump scare, you really question if they just added puzzles because Resident Evil requires puzzles. The bonfire one is used several times and is more an annoying battle with the physics than anything else. The best ones are the optional puzzle with the racing platforms, where you actually need to think and take several steps, and the room with the bells you have to shoot, since that requires some awareness of your surroundings. It feels like the developers never want you to stay too long in the same location, so even the puzzles needed to be short and concise. This is a shame since some of the environments are beautiful. Just hurry along cause this roller coaster is not going to end. All in all, with this section I just wanted to point out how the Resident Evil formula is present, but in a much lesser form. I feel that many elements are just there because they are part of the RE formula, but not because the developers felt really inspired to make unique or fun variations of these elements. The puzzles especially were the biggest letdown for me, since they had so obvious answers. I can understand that others would feel different or don't have the problems with these changes, which is fine, the game is still a fun roller coaster. But it's just so restrictive in the elements that I always loved about the franchise, and adds so little new on top of it, that I don't see me playing this over the other RE games if I want to play through a Resident Evil experience. Having gone through the more technical elements of the game that make up the general gameplay loop, and compared that to previous games, and now I want to discuss where this game fails to make its own unique mark in the context of the Resident Evil franchise, in what it offers in the more unique elements. To just quickly kick the door in, I feel this game takes a lot of inspiration from other games in the series, but all these inspirations just result in being lesser forms of the original material. We already discussed how some elements are directly taken from RE4 and 7, but I feel that the village's separate acts are directly inspired by the older games. For this segment I will take the different acts and compare them to what I see as the inspirations for elements in these acts. This can vary from thematic, gameplay or narrative elements. While I do the comparison, I will also add my view on what game did what element better. Some of these comparisons are really direct, as for example the inventory system of RE4 and RE8, but some are more indirect, like the scenarios or villain/moods these chapters are trying to convey. The first act after the prologue is the introduction of the village and its denizens. I would not surprise anyone if I say that this is directly inspired by the start of Resident Evil 4. You go to a rural village somewhere in Europe and realize something weird is going on there. In RE4 that was because Leon was looking for the president's daughter and she was sighted there. And in RE8 this was because Ethan and Rose crashed close to it since Miranda, who was the fake corpse of Mia in the truck, needed to be there with Rose. Immediately, at the start, there is one major difference, in that the locals in the village are not aware of the plans of their leaders, and happen to be attacked by lichens when Ethan arrives there. In Resident Evil 4, the villagers are affected with the parasites, and are working together with the bad guys. When Leon meets the first villager, he interacts with them as a normal person, before the man attacks them, raising questions about the villagers and what they are hiding in their town. In RE8, you first question whether the denizens have a gun, and the first villager you meet is in distress because of some unknown threat, until he's immediately killed and you are attacked by a lichen, raising questions about what is happening to the village. All the villagers you meet in RE4 try to kill you on sight, and you find proof that they are part of some cult. Not until much later you realize that they are affected, when they start growing tails and such, when you blow their heads off, for example. In RE8, all the non-infected villagers are killed in the first 30 minutes, and it just starts to become a question of where are all these lichens coming from. They do convey in this cutscene that they worship someone who is called Mother Miranda, but they are considered nothing more than pawns or lambs, ready to be turned by Miranda. This also makes me question why they worship Miranda and the Lords. It is hinted that Miranda helps them with diseases and problems, but she is by now over 100 years old, and even the villagers know that locations like the castles are guaranteed death sentences when you go there. Why would these villagers worship these individuals or even stay here? In RE4 the villagers are presented as a part of the scheme of the villains, so it makes sense that they stay there. But in RE8 they seem nothing more than rats stuck in a lab that worship the doctors like saints. I also feel that RE4 succeeded way more in making the village an otherworldly place. Both villagers are presented as distant from society and kind of stuck in the past. But Ethan is a 5-minute hike away from his crash on a presumably commonly used road, whereas Leon has to go out of his way to get there with the help of Spanish policemen. In RE4 they speak a form of Spanish.
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
It is fair to say that for most players this added to the feeling of being in an unknown place where you were an outsider. Even the policemen at the start speak with an accent when talking English to you.
Oh, you crazy American.
In RE8 they speak accentless English.
Julian, go make yourself useful and check the grounds. I said go!
Maybe Ethan has become so accustomed to speaking the language that he can understand it fluently, but there is no hint for that. The game also goes out of its way to never mention where the game takes place, except with little hints like the names of characters and recipes. Being called an outsider by the old man has no way the same effect as actively feeling like an outsider by not being able to understand the locals. This inspiration is even made more blatantly present when both games quite quickly have a survival segment, where you have to survive an attack from the main monsters until bell rings and they retreat. In RE4 it was a segment that used cutscenes to convey that the villagers were relentlessly hunting you, and that you had to barricade yourself to keep them outside. The multiple scenes also helped in showing that you were progressing, without directly stating what you had to do. In RE8 this happens immediately after hearing a radio message to go to a nearby house, and the only cutscene that happens is the one at the end of the gunland. I think I'm not the only one when I say that this segment was quite frustrating the first time, because it was not clear what was going on, and I had no clear idea what to do. I thought I maybe had to kill all the lichens, but he just kept appearing, and with the big hammer-wielding monster, your chances of survival were pretty slim. It is possibly the hardest segment in the game. I died several times walking around looking for an exit, but there were none. I either died or lost all my ammo before giving up and retrying. I eventually had to look online to find out what I actually had to do, which was just surviving for a certain amount of time. Because RE8 goes for a first-person perspective, even in all the cutscenes, you also get these weird moments where the game is clearly breaking logic to get you in certain places. For this cutscene you had to be immobilized between the buildings on the river. But because I was inside a building trying to outmaneuver the lichens for time, I got the lichen teleported behind me out of nowhere, who then grabs me and literally throws me through a wall that doesn't break to get me in the spot for the cutscene. Maybe the style of cutscenes RE4, where you see things that Leon most likely can't, are not as immersive as the first-person view. But if that means concessions like teleportation to make it happen, it is way more immersive breaking for me. In conclusion, I would say that the village part of RE8 just leaves a lot to be desired. For something that's put in the spotlight, it is even part of the title, it has little presence in the actual game. You get little idea about the actual villagers, which is a shame since this little moment with the different ones did hint at the long history of the village and its denizens. It serves as nothing more than a hub area, and the one set piece it has is just a frustrating roadblock that is more confusing than its 15-year-old inspiration.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
After the little circus with all the lords, we go to the first attraction of the game, which is the castle, housing Lady D and her daughters. The castle is a big residence where you have to fight zombies and you are chased by bigger, unkillable threats, while trying to solve puzzles. This is pretty classic Resident Evil, where it takes elements of the Resident Evil 1 and 2 and the remakes and combines them. Specifically the old-style mansion with interconnected hallways with locked doors and puzzles from the first game, and the chaser monsters from the Resident Evil 2 remake and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. You are introduced to the villains quite quickly after entering, and after that cutscene you are free to explore the mansion. Bit by bit you progress further, and sometimes you have to deal with zombies that you can kill or outrun. Pretty classic stuff for the franchise. It even has the dual-floored main hall with several doors, which you will loop back to several times. Sadly, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the puzzles are not interesting. There are some unique rooms, but with the fact that this whole segment is just really short and you can't go back to it after completing it, it just feels disappointing with the lost potential. I find this such a shame, since the visuals of the different rooms are great and I wouldn't have minded to stay here for longer or return. But like many segments of this world, it is just so separated from the rest of the game. Once you go through this specific door on the second floor, you have to deal for the first time with being chased by one of the daughters. Outrunning them is not that hard, and you can't really stop them, let alone knock them out. It is more a case of getting to the correct door before they kill you. You can only really hit them in the designated boss rooms. This also counts for Lady D, who you will meet several times, but is an unkillable powerhouse. It is possible to make her flinch with explosions, but that only happens a limited amount of times and then she's pretty much unstunnable. Shooting her is literally a waste of ammo, and since she's so easy to dodge and outrun, she's more of an annoyance than a threat. She doesn't have the constant pressure of Mr. X in RE2 Remake with his constant heroic footsteps. Sure, he wasn't killable either, but he could be stunned for half a minute if you really needed it, and he was way more relentless in chasing you. She just mostly roams around the main hall, and unless she is on the road to the next door, she is just not a threat. The only segment where she is dangerous is the one where she cuts off your hand, but that one is easily solved by walking around pillars, because she will always chase you around. Hell, Nemesis in the original iteration of RE3 is a way more frightening chaser, with being faster and having access to ranged weaponry. If you do incapacitate him, you even get weapon upgrades, making the hellish fights with him a risk, but worth it. Hell, the Nemesis in the earlier parts of the remake is a way more dangerous and imposing chaser for many of the same reason as his predecessor, and that version is extremely neutered. This is not to say that this segment wasn't fun to go through, especially since it is carried with great visual designs, the unique characters and cutscenes with Lady D and her daughters. Moments like Lady D screaming about you killing her daughters or ordering one of them to kill you are great little touches. It is just a damn shame that it is over before it really gets going, and the classic RE elements are present in really basic and simple forms. The next segment is the Benevito section, which makes a lot of references to RE7, directly with a lot of talks about Mia, but also by taking a lot of inspiration from classical horror movies and games. Maybe a bit of a side tangent here, but I wasn't the biggest fan of RE7 for mainly two reasons. The first one being that it took a lot of cues from horror games in the style of Amnesia. Like I stated at the start of the video, I don't really like these kinds of games, but it is clearly a matter of personal taste and not a condemnation for the quality of that genre. My second reason was the big presence of elements that are more inspired by horror films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with the Hillbilly Horror, and the Saw franchise with the Lucas torture puzzle section. This is not to say that RE7 is a bad game. I think the start in the mansion is great Resident Evil stuff, but from the Margaret section on, it just becomes less RE for me and more a movie tie-in horror title. The reason why I bring this up now is because I feel this section does this again. It is separated in two parts, where the first part is the classic horror game with no weapons and the present monster just kills you when you are close, and the fear is mainly based on having to look around the corner to see the monsters and being chased by it. The main hallway that you go through several times is made in such a way that you have to go past two corners. So you have to commit to look past the corner to see if there is anything there. First time the rooms are clearly lit, but once the baby has arrived, the floor is littered with blood and guts, and you can't see that far anymore because of the darkness. I feel this hallway is specifically made just to make these moments of anxiety, and is common in games like Amnesia. This is even more blatant when the second time you meet the baby, you have to trick it by hiding in the closet or under the bed. The first time I entered this room, I opened the closet and realized I could hide in it, This area is the only place where you have these closets where you can do this. Since it was a dead end, I immediately knew that once I turned around, I would meet the fetus again, and I had to hide in this room, so I could go past the baby. Even when the game is taking elements from other horror games, it just takes the most basic form of it and places it there in total vacuum of the rest of the game. Moments like these just show the strings hanging from the dolls and makes the situation feel extremely contrived. I would be lying if I said that this segment wasn't affected at instilling fear, because it absolutely is. Put it to this, it just stops being RE and turns into a completely different game. The second part is the boss fight with Donna. It is an easy hide-and-seek segment, but it is scary because of them dolls. This once again just something that references all these dolls-focused horror movies. Sure, it is unsettling, but it feels so out of place. When I think Resident Evil, I think of zombies and mutated monsters. This once again just feels put in there because a certain movie genre is popular and effective at making people scared. Even though I feel this segment is the least Resident Evil of the whole game, it is clearly an effective chapter. It is scary, and a lot of people had positive responses to that. It is even fair to say that it is a really short highlight of the game, but I feel that is more an indication of the blandness or disappointing nature of the rest of the game than a result of well thought out or unique game design. The following section is the Moreau section. For this, I will mainly focus on the part after Moreau has whined about his mama issues and then falls back into the water, turning into his big fish form. This is not to say that the previous section doesn't matter, but that section is there more for introduction of Moreau and primarily focuses on the common challenges of fighting the Lycan. Moreau swims around while you walk on the platforms, and there are walkways that Moreau can swim through, which will instantly kill you if you happen to be there. If for any unknown reason you fall in the water, you die. There are some more solid platforms that you can stand on. Some of these can be broken by Moreau after a couple of hits, but mostly are complete safe spaces. I don't think it's far-reaching to say that this section is inspired by the water monster of RE4. It is not totally fair to compare those, since that was a boss fight and this is more of a set piece leading up to a boss fight. But I think the comparison is worthwhile, because both sections focus on the thrill and fear that can be instilled with big water monsters. I think it's fair to say that scenarios like these are scary in the sense that water is not a natural element for humans, and with water predators that we are in a dire situation. Even in boats, we are not in a situation where we can easily move around compared to if we could just walk or run. RE4 played on this by having your boat getting stuck to the monster, losing all control of movement and being forced to move on high speed. And we have to fight back by standing still and throw the harpoons. If we fail, we fall in the water and have to desperately mash buttons to get back to the closest points that give something sturdy to stand on. This is maybe a contrived section with a quick time events and all, but it is a minor set piece that takes at most 10 minutes. In RE Village, the opposite is mostly the case. Most of the platforms are your safe havens on which you can stay on forever. A couple, like the platform top which you talk with Pro, or the ship you can raise from the water, will be attacked by the big fish while you stand on top of them, and eventually break, leading to your death. The only section you are really forced to rush are the water walkways and the razor platforms that are on a timer. To be quite honest, these sections make me suspect they were added just to give an explicit reason to rush and run, because Moreau himself is not big enough of a threat to be the actual reason, even though the game is presenting it as otherwise. This is an example of the game being effective in conveying the mood it is going for, but on repeat playthroughs you start to realize that even though the game presents these scenarios as dangerous, they are in fact not. Once you return to the dam, you have a boss fight with him. The fight is fine and I find the many fisheye a cool visual, but nothing really stands out about it. Overall I would say the RE8 section is fine. I just feel that RE4 used the fear of being in open water in a more convincing and legitimate way, while also being a more unique set piece. The following section is the Lycan Stronghold, and there is not much to say. I would say it is similar to the prison section of RE4, in that they mostly share the same role. At both of these points in the games, you are used to the combat system, have upgraded your weapons, and have hopefully a lot of ammo of you. They turn up the challenge by forcing you to fight big numbers of enemies, while making you fight the bigger variants that you have met before. Now you are the one looking for a fight instead of minimizing enemy contact. Honestly, there's not much to say about this section. The following part is the factory. This part is the final gauntlet before the end. I would say that this section is a combination of the final acts of RE4 and 7. A lab in a remote location filled with a lot of reviews about the story and the big challenges in the terms of fight. In RE4 and A, they also both introduce new enemies that have bigger health pools and require a bit more thought to kill them. In RE4 these were the regenerators that required a lot of firepower, but by exploiting their weakness, which you only could clearly see with the infrared scope on the sniper, you could also slow them down and easily dispatch them. They also drop a lot of money, which makes it worthwhile to take them out, even if they are dangerous enemies. In Village, you have several versions of the super soldier made by Heisenberg. They do share the common weakness of the red engine on their heart, which allows you to stun them and do a lot of damage. The different variations differ in mobility or armor aspects, where some can fly short distances and charge you, or have a lot of armor requiring explosives to peel those off. One unique variation is Propellerhead, who has this weakness on his back and serves more as a mini-boss fight. I just wanted to mention that he lost both arms because he stuck them in the propeller, which I think is hilarious. All of these enemies are here to challenge you, but also give you a reason to spend a lot of the ammo that you have collected so far. Most Resident Evil games have these segments in the game to be cathartic. Now you finally release all the tension you have been building up to over the game, but it keeps it fresh by adding new stuff, in addition to the big amount of enemies they put in front of your barrel. Besides being harder to kill, they also create new challenges which require smart use of your tools to dispatch them. This is why I think this segment is way more successful in achieving those goals in Village than it was in 7, where the salt mine just consists of small corridors with a common molding just rush you. The final section before the boss is the Chris Redfield section, and this just feels like an average FPS. You have powerful weapons with loads of ammo. He's built like a tank and can call in airstrikes. I got a lot of flashbacks to RE5 and 6, but that is mostly because in both of those games you played Chris, and those games were primarily action games. Once again, it is cathartic to be able to just start blasting on the Lycans that have been tormenting you throughout the game, but it kinda loses this feeling, since this section is completely separated from the main game. He has enough of his own ammos and weapons to kill everything at least twice, and now you're fighting with tools you've never accessed with when playing Ethan. This segment also shows you that the game is not a great first-person shooter, since it still feels clunky and slow, even if you're now playing with a highly trained veteran soldier. It is still just a case of shoot ahead, walk backwards and survive. Even the boss fight at the end feels underwhelming. You fight another of the hammer-wielding guys again, only this time it has a spiked mace and a helmet on. Dodging the swing is not hard, but is cumbersome since the arena is so small, and the most damage is done by the airstrike, making this fight rather a waiting game till that weapon is reloaded. I also feel because of that, the dude is extra slow, to account for the time it takes to aim the weapon. Earlier when you had to destroy the wooden fortress, this was annoying since there are so many Lycans and once you get hit you had to re-aim again. But that at least made it hard. The big guy on the other hand just takes so long to recover from his swing, and when he does, he really takes his time to start swinging again. It just makes the whole fight kinda underwhelming. The last section that follows is the final boss fight. Overall, I would say this stands on its own, challenging you in different ways and has multiple phases. A neat visual callback is the phase where Miranda grows spider legs. Then she has a big visual resemblance to Sessler of RE4. But besides that, the arena, mechanics and visuals are nothing the same. In conclusion, I would say that the game is clearly segmented, and mostly by the lords and their domains. This results in a lot of variety, but I feel most of these segments are inspired by elements present in the previous games, and that most of them result in poorer versions of the originals. This does make the game feel like an RE theme park, but also results in the feeling that there is a lot of disconnect going on. The game is called Village, but rather than one varied location, it's more of a neighborhood with different unrelated districts. And instead of these districts trying to be unique, they just imitate the older games. This does make Resident Evil Village some form of love letter to the franchise, but since it wants to do it all, none really exceed the originals. If you really like the castle, go play RE2 Remake, with its better realized location and more imposing chaser. If you really like the feeling of the rustic and disturbing mood of the village, play Resident Evil 4, where there are more dense scenes that actively make you feel like an outsider in the middle of nowhere farm town. Or maybe you really like the dread of the doll's house, then go play RE7, it will really spook you. RE8 is not a bad Resident Evil game, since a lot of the DNA of the series is clearly present. It just meanders from beginning to end trying to hit all the notes, making all the separate elements individually suffer for it. Overall, I think Resident Evil Village is a fun game with high production quality. It is a thrilling ride where you will experience fear, action, disgust, sorrow, and horniness if you're into that. For Resident Evil fans, it hits all the notes of the previous RE games. And for general horror or action fans, there is something to slake those specific thirsts. Even though it tries to spin a lot of plates, it succeeds in presenting them all quite consistently in terms of quality. And this is partly due to fast pacing. It is pretty unlikely that you get the feeling that you are spending too much time on a location or activity. Even though I personally wish we had a bit more time to take in the scenery or spend more time with the different characters. Where this game just fell short for me is that because of the fast pacing and because it wants to do it all, I feel the Resident Evil DNA that I'm looking for is present in quite a basic form. Loads of time I am thinking how the present elements all have been done better in previous iterations, and I would have preferred that the developers either specifically focus on a small handful of these elements or rather focus on giving a totally new and unique experience, which hopefully would have resulted in a less disjointed total package than the one we got. If you have reached the end of this video, I want to thank you very much for watching and having the patience to do so. That's much appreciated. This video has been in the mental pipeline for the last 2 years, so I'm happy that I finally did finish it. Maybe this will be the first of more videos about video games in general, about topics that I think are interesting about them, but who knows. For what it is worth, I at least did really enjoy this progress of making this video, and I've learned much. If you have any thoughts, be they positive, be they negative, let me know. I'm really interested. And with that, the video is truly finished.